Lion receives final visit from his elderly benefactor. What happens next is unbelievable. The wheelchair's rubber tires crunched softly against the gravel path as Marcus Wellington made what he knew would be his final journey to the wildlife sanctuary he had built from nothing. At 73, with only weeks left according to his doctors, every breath felt precious, every moment weighted with the finality of approaching death. The morning mist still clung to the rolling hills surrounding the 200-acre preserve, and the familiar sounds of awakening wildlife filled the crisp autumn air, exotic birds calling to each other across vast enclosures, the distant trumpet of elephants greeting the dawn, and somewhere in the distance, the low rumble that could only belong to big cats beginning their day. But there was one last goodbye he needed to make. One final conversation with a soul who had taught him more about forgiveness than any priest, therapist, or philosopher ever could. "Are you sure about this, Mr. Wellington?" asked James, his caregiver, adjusting the oxygen tank strapped to the back of the wheelchair. The portable unit had become a constant companion over the past month, as Marcus's lungs struggled against the aggressive cancer that was systematically shutting down his body. The doctors said you shouldn't be exerting yourself, especially with the morning chill. Marcus's weathered hand waved dismissively, though the gesture took more effort than it once did. The simple movement sent a sharp pain through his arthritic joints, a constant reminder of the disease that was claiming him piece by piece. "James, I've been coming here for 15 years. I'm not about to let a little thing like dying stop me now." His voice, once booming and authoritative, the voice that had commanded boardrooms and sealed million-pound deals, had become a whisper. But it still carried the stubborn determination that had made him one of London's most successful businessmen. The irony wasn't lost on him. He had spent his entire adult life accumulating wealth, building an empire of electronics stores across the UK, crushing competitors with ruthless efficiency, and yet here in his final days, none of that mattered. The stock portfolios, the real estate holdings, the luxury cars gathering dust in his garage, all meaningless. What mattered was this place, these animals, and most importantly, the magnificent creature who had been waiting for him every morning for the past 8 years. The Serenity Wildlife Sanctuary sprawled across 200 acres of carefully maintained habitat, home to rescued lions, tigers, elephants, and dozens of other species that had nowhere else to go. The facility was a marvel of modern conservation architecture, state-of-the-art veterinary hospitals, spacious enclosures designed to mimic natural habitats, and rehabilitation centers that had successfully reintroduced dozens of animals back to the wild. What most visitors didn't know was that every enclosure, every veterinary facility, every blade of grass had been paid for by the frail man now being wheeled down the main path. Marcus had invested over £30 million into this sanctuary over the past 15 years, but he had never put his name on a building or demanded recognition. To the world, he was simply another wealthy donor. Only a handful of people knew the true reason behind his extraordinary generosity, the guilt-driven compulsion that had transformed a cutthroat businessman into one of Britain's most significant wildlife conservationists. As they passed the primate enclosure, a group of rescued chimpanzees rushed to the fence, chattering excitedly. They recognized Marcus, just as many of the animals did. He had spent countless hours with each species, learning their individual personalities, their histories, their traumas. There was Matilda, the elderly orangutan, who had been rescued from a Thai zoo where she had been forced to box tourists for entertainment. Her eyes still held the wariness of decades of abuse, but she would always approach the fence when Marcus visited, as if sensing a kindred spirit. Then there was Thunder, the massive African elephant who had lost his entire family to poachers before being captured and sold to a circus. The psychological scars ran deep. Thunder still exhibited the repetitive swaying behavior that indicated severe trauma. But gradually, Over years of patient interaction with Marcus and the sanctuary staff, he had begun to show signs of healing. The sight of this gentle giant slowly learning to trust again had moved Marcus to tears more than once. As they approached the large cat section, Marcus felt his heart rate quicken, not from exertion, but from anticipation. The big cat area was the crown jewel of the sanctuary, featuring several species-appropriate habitats that had cost nearly £8 million to construct. There were Siberian tigers rescued from illegal breeding operations, jaguars confiscated from drug cartels who had kept them as twisted status symbols, and leopards saved from the exotic pet trade. But it was the African lion habitat that drew Marcus like a magnet. The enclosure was massive, nearly 10 acres of rolling grassland dotted with acacia trees, rocky outcroppings for climbing, and a natural spring-fed pond. It was as close to the African savanna as money and expertise could create in the English countryside. There, in the spacious enclosure that mimicked his ancestral homeland, a magnificent lion lifted his massive head at the sound of approaching footsteps. Even from a distance, Cairo was breathtaking. At 8 years old, he was in his prime, over 400 pounds of muscle and sinew, with a mane so thick and dark it seemed to absorb the morning light. His golden eyes, intelligent and watchful, scanned the approaching group with the casual confidence that could only belong to the king of beasts. "A Cairo," Marcus whispered, and incredibly, the lion's ears pricked up at the sound of his name. Even more remarkably, the massive predator began moving toward them with deliberate purpose, his powerful stride covering the distance with fluid grace. Dr. Sarah Chen, the sanctuary's head veterinarian, appeared at Marcus's side, her expression a mixture of professional concern and deep personal affection. At 38, Sarah had dedicated her entire career to wildlife rehabilitation, earning her doctorate from Cambridge before spending 5 years in Kenya studying lion behavior in the wild. She had been with the sanctuary since its early days, personally overseeing the rescue and rehabilitation of over 300 animals. But never, in all her years of experience, had she witnessed a bond like the one between Marcus and Cairo. She had been expecting this visit, dreading it even. Marcus had called her 3 days ago with a simple but heartbreaking request. He wanted to say goodbye to Cairo properly, and he wanted to do it alone. The conversation had been brief, but Sarah could hear the weight of finality in his voice, the quiet acceptance of a man who had made peace with his mortality. "Marcus, you know I can't let you go into the enclosure," Sarah said gently, crouching beside his wheelchair. Her voice carried the authority of someone who had spent years working with dangerous predators, but also the tenderness of a friend who understood what this moment meant to him. "Cairo may trust you more than any human he's ever known, but he's still a 400-pound predator. His instincts, his strength, one moment of confusion or startlement could be catastrophic." She didn't finish the sentence. They both knew the risks. Lions, no matter how bonded to humans, were still wild animals driven by instincts millions of years in the making. "Sarah, my dear," Marcus replied, his eyes never leaving the approaching lion, "I have terminal cancer. The doctors have given me perhaps 3 weeks, maybe less. What exactly am I afraid of at this point? Death?" He paused, watching Cairo's magnificent approach. "I've been dying slowly for months. If something were to happen today, at least it would be quick, and it would be here with him." The words hung in the air between them, stark and honest, in a way that made James shift uncomfortably behind the wheelchair. But Sarah understood. She had worked with enough terminal patients, both human and animal, to recognize the peace that sometimes came with acceptance, the strange clarity that emerged when all pretense was stripped away. Cairo had been rescued as a 6-month-old cub from an illegal circus operation in Eastern Europe, a hellish traveling show that had toured the Balkans, exploiting animals for profit while keeping them in conditions that would have shocked even the most callous observer. When the sanctuary's rescue team arrived at the compound in Romania, they found 23 animals living in squalor. Bears forced to dance on hot plates, monkeys chained to tiny cages, and Cairo, then a terrified, malnourished cub, locked in a metal container barely large enough for his growing body. The rescue operation had been coordinated with Interpol and local authorities, but by the time they reached the compound, the psychological damage was already extensive. Cairo had been beaten into submission by trainers who used fear as their primary tool. Electric prods, whips, starvation, all were employed to break the young lion's spirit and force compliance with their brutal training methods. His spirit seemed completely broken. He wouldn't eat, wouldn't play, wouldn't even look at the humans trying to help him. When he arrived at the sanctuary 8 years ago, Cairo weighed less than 60 pounds, nearly 30 pounds underweight for a cub of his age. He was malnourished, traumatized, and utterly terrified of human contact. The veterinary team wasn't even sure he would survive the first week. His immune system was compromised. His digestive system was damaged from eating spoiled meat scraps, and worst of all, his psychological state seemed beyond repair. The other staff members had nearly given up hope of rehabilitating him when Marcus began visiting daily, sitting for hours outside the enclosure, simply talking to the frightened animal. At first, Cairo would cower in the far corner of his temporary holding area whenever humans approached. But Marcus was different. He didn't try to coax or command or treat Cairo like a circus attraction. He simply sat in a folding chair outside the fence and talked about his day, his thoughts, his own fears and loneliness. For weeks, there was no visible progress. Marcus would arrive each morning at dawn and remain until dusk, speaking in low, soothing tones, while Cairo huddled in his corner, trembling. The sanctuary staff thought the old businessman was wasting his time, that some animals were simply too damaged to recover. But Marcus persisted with a patience that surprised everyone who knew his reputation as a hard-driving corporate executive. The breakthrough came after 6 weeks of this routine. Marcus was sitting in his usual spot, reading aloud from the morning newspaper, a habit he had developed to fill the silence, when he noticed that Cairo had moved. Just slightly, perhaps 6 inches closer to the fence, but it was movement toward rather than away. Marcus felt his heart skip, but he forced himself to continue reading as if nothing had changed, knowing that any sudden excitement might send the cub retreating again. Over the following months, Cairo's recovery was measured in tiny increments. One day, he would venture close enough to the fence to sniff the air near where Marcus sat. The next week, he might stay in the open when Marcus arrived, instead of immediately seeking the darkest corner of his space. Each small step forward felt like a monumental victory to Marcus, who had begun to see his own healing reflected in Cairo's gradual emergence from trauma. It had taken 6 months before Cairo would approach the fence when Marcus was there, 6 months of patient, consistent presence before the cub showed the first sign of trust. Another year passed before he would accept food from Marcus's hand through the chain link, his powerful jaws surprisingly gentle as they took the offering. But gradually, impossibly, a bond had formed between the grieving businessman and the rescued lion that defied everything the experts knew about wild animal psychology. The staff veterinarians documented Cairo's transformation with growing amazement. His weight increased to a healthy level, his coat became lustrous and thick, and most remarkably, he began to exhibit normal lion behaviors, playing, exploring his environment, and eventually developing the magnificent mane that now crowned his massive head. But it was his response to Marcus that truly puzzled the experts. Cairo would pace restlessly when Marcus was late for his daily visits, would position himself by the fence where he could see the main path, and would become visibly agitated if too many days passed between visits. Dr. Chen had consulted with colleagues around the world, searching for similar cases of human-lion bonding, but the relationship between Marcus and Cairo seemed to exist in a category of its own. It transcended the typical dynamics of domestication or even the well-documented cases of wild animals, forming attachments to their rescuers. This was something deeper, more profound, as if two wounded souls had recognized each other across the vast divide of species and circumstance. "I remember the first time you let me touch your mane," Marcus said softly, his voice carrying across the space between them as Cairo approached the fence with measured steps. "Oh, you were so scared, so broken, rather like I was, I suppose." The truth was, Marcus had been broken when he first discovered the sanctuary 15 years ago, though he had hidden his pain behind the veneer of professional success that had defined his public persona for decades. His wife of 40 years, Eleanor, had just passed away after a brutal 18-month battle with Alzheimer's disease, a fight that had drained not only their financial resources, but Marcus's emotional reserves as well. Eleanor had been more than his wife. She had been his moral compass, the gentle voice that had softened his harder edges and reminded him that wealth without purpose was merely accumulation. She had always wanted children, but Marcus had been too focused on building his business empire, too convinced that there would always be time later for family. Later, when the company was bigger, when the next acquisition was complete, when they had achieved just one more milestone. But later never came, and by the time they began trying seriously for children, it was too late. Eleanor couldn't conceive, and the fertility treatments available in the 1980s were limited and unsuccessful. The childlessness had created a quiet ache in their marriage, a missing piece that they rarely discussed but both deeply felt. Eleanor had thrown herself into charity work, becoming a patron of several children's organizations, while Marcus had buried himself even deeper in business. They loved each other profoundly, but there was always that sense of incompleteness, of a life not fully lived. When Eleanor began showing signs of dementia, Marcus initially tried to handle everything himself, hiring the best private care, consulting with specialists around the world, sparing no expense in the fight to preserve her mind. But Alzheimer's is a cruel thief that steals its victims gradually, and Marcus was forced to watch helplessly as the woman he loved disappeared piece by piece. The final months had been the worst, when Eleanor no longer recognized him, when she would become frightened and agitated in his presence, treating him like a stranger who was somehow keeping her from going home. If this story is touching your heart already, please consider liking this video and subscribing to our channel for more incredible real-life stories that will restore your faith in the connections we share with all living beings. James watched nervously as Cairo approached the fence, the lion's massive paws making no sound on the soft earth despite his enormous size. The grace with which such a powerful predator moved never ceased to amaze visitors to the sanctuary. Each step was calculated, purposeful, displaying the natural athleticism that had evolved over millions of years on the African plains. "Sir, maybe we should maintain some distance," James began, his voice betraying his anxiety. As Marcus's primary caregiver for the past 6 months, he had witnessed the gradual decline in his employer's health, but he had also observed something else, a sense of peace and purpose that seemed to emanate from these daily visits to the sanctuary. Still, his professional instincts made him nervous about any situation that could potentially compromise Marcus's fragile health. But Marcus was already maneuvering his wheelchair as close to the enclosure as possible, his trembling hands working the controls with determination that belied his weakened state. The electric wheelchair had been a recent necessity, replacing the walking stick he had used for months before his legs finally gave out completely. Cairo reached the fence and, incredibly, performed a gesture that never failed to move everyone who witnessed it. The massive lion lay down with deliberate care, pressing his body against the chain link where Marcus could reach through the diamond-shaped openings to touch his thick mane. It was a position of complete vulnerability for a predator, lying on his side, exposing his belly, offering his neck to human hands. The trust implicit in this gesture was extraordinary, defying every instinct that should have governed a wild animal's behavior. "Hello, old friend," Marcus whispered, his trembling fingers threading through the coarse hair. The mane was warm from the morning sun, thick and luxurious in a way that spoke of excellent health and proper nutrition. Cairo rumbled, not quite a purr, but a deep, content sound that vibrated through his massive chest and seemed to resonate in Marcus's own ribcage. Dr. Chen stood transfixed, watching the interaction with professional fascination and personal emotion. In all her years of veterinary work, she had never seen anything like this. Lions simply didn't behave this way with humans, especially not with someone who wasn't their daily caregiver. Yet here was Cairo, clearly recognizing not just Marcus's presence, but his distress. The lion's golden eyes were fixed on Marcus's face with an intensity that suggested awareness, understanding, even empathy. "He knows, doesn't he?" Marcus asked, his voice breaking slightly as he continued to stroke Cairo's mane. "He knows I'm dying." "Animals are incredibly perceptive," Sarah replied softly, moving closer to observe the interaction. "They can sense changes in scent, in behavior, in the way we carry ourselves. Illness changes our body chemistry in ways we're only beginning to understand. Cairo has always been especially attuned to you, but today—" She paused, studying the lion's behavior. "Today he seems different, more gentle, more protective." Marcus closed his eyes, feeling the warmth of the afternoon sun on his face and the coarse texture of Cairo's mane beneath his fingers. He thought back to all the hours they had spent together, Marcus talking about his fears, his regrets, his loneliness, while Cairo listened with the patience that only wild things seem to possess. In those early days, Marcus had convinced himself that he was helping Cairo heal from his trauma. Only gradually had he realized that the healing was flowing both ways. "I need to tell you something," Marcus said to Sarah, his voice barely audible above the gentle rumbling coming from Cairo's chest. "About why I really built this place. About the guilt that's been eating at me for 45 years. Sarah moved closer, sensing the weight of what was coming. James, too, leaned forward, suddenly understanding that this moment was about more than just saying goodbye to a beloved animal. 45 years ago, I was a young man working in Kenya for a British mining company," Marcus began, his eyes still closed, his hand never stopping its gentle motion through Cairo's mane. "Wellington Mining Enterprises, my family's company, though I was just a junior engineer at the time. We were expanding operations in the Masai Mara region, and there was a pride of lions that had been living on the land for generations. Beautiful, magnificent creatures who had roamed those grasslands for countless years." Marcus's hand trembled against Cairo's mane, and the lion seemed to sense his distress, pressing closer to the fence with a soft rumble of comfort. The local government wanted them relocated to a protected area. It would have cost perhaps £50,000, a negligible amount for a company our size. The Maasai elders offered to help with the relocation, knew exactly where the pride could be moved safely, but the company executives, my own family members, decided it would be cheaper and more expedient to have them eliminated. Tears began to run down Marcus's weathered cheeks. I was just a junior engineer, 28 years old, fresh out of university. I told myself there was nothing I could do, that I had no authority to challenge the decision, but I could have spoken up, I could have fought harder, I could have found the money to relocate them myself. I had a trust fund, inheritance from my grandfather. Instead, I did nothing, and 12 lions died because of my cowardice. The silence that followed was profound. Even the distant sounds of the sanctuary seemed muted, as if the entire preserve was holding its breath. Cairo shifted slightly, and for a moment Sarah thought he might move away from such obvious distress. Instead, the lion did something extraordinary that would be talked about by the sanctuary staff for years to come. He lifted his massive head and gently pressed it against the fence, where Marcus's forehead rested against the chain link. For a moment, man and lion touched through the metal barrier, separated by species and circumstance, but connected by something deeper than either could fully understand. "I've carried that guilt for 45 years, Marcus continued, his voice thick with emotion. "Every success I had in business, every pound I earned, it all felt tainted by those 12 lives I failed to save. When Eleanor died and I found myself alone, rattling around in that enormous house, I was looking for a way to make amends. This sanctuary, all of it, every enclosure, every rescued animal, every rehabilitation program, it's my attempt to balance the scales." "Marcus," Sarah began, but he held up his hand. "But it never felt like enough until I met this magnificent creature," he said, his fingers tightening gently in Cairo's mane. "Somehow, through caring for him, watching him heal, seeing him learn to trust again, it felt like redemption. Like maybe, just maybe, I could find forgiveness for what I couldn't save all those years ago." Cairo rumbled again, that deep, contented sound that spoke of trust and peace. His golden eyes remained fixed on Marcus's face with an intensity that seemed to transcend normal animal awareness. "He's forgiven me," Marcus whispered, wonder evident in his voice. "Somehow, this beautiful soul has forgiven me for what I couldn't save all those years ago." James wiped his own eyes, no longer concerned about safety protocols or medical recommendations. He was witnessing something sacred, something that couldn't be quantified or explained in any medical textbook or caregiver training manual. "Marcus," Sarah said carefully, her voice thick with emotion, "I have something to tell you too, something about Cairo's background that we never shared with you, something that might explain this extraordinary bond you've shared." Marcus looked up, his hand still resting on the lion's mane, his eyes questioning. "When we rescued Cairo from that circus, we did extensive investigating into his history. We wanted to understand where he came from, how he had ended up in such horrific conditions. He wasn't bred in captivity like we originally thought." Sarah paused, clearly struggling with the magnitude of what she was about to reveal. He was captured from the wild as a very young cub, stolen from his mother when he was barely 8 weeks old. She took a deep breath before continuing. "He was captured in Kenya from a pride that was being dispersed because of mining operations. Based on the documentation we recovered from the circus operators and the timeline of his capture," Sarah's voice broke slightly. "Marcus, the area where Cairo was taken, the company involved in the land clearance, it was Wellington Mining Enterprises." The silence that followed was absolute. Marcus stared at Sarah, then at Cairo, the implications of her words slowly sinking in like stones dropping into still water. The mathematical impossibility of such a coincidence warred with the undeniable evidence before his eyes. "You're saying—" Marcus's voice was barely a whisper. We can't know for certain. But based on the timeline, location and company records, it's not just possible. It's probable that Cairo's pride was one of the groups affected by the mining expansion you were part of all those years ago. He might be a direct descendant of the lions you've been seeking forgiveness from for 4 decades. Marcus felt the world shift around him, reality rearranging itself into patterns too meaningful to be mere chance. The weight of coincidence, or perhaps something greater than coincidence, settled over the moment like a blessing. His fingers tightened gently in Cairo's mane as the full magnitude of Sarah's revelation washed over him. "My God," he breathed, his voice breaking completely. "You found your way to me. After all these years, across all these miles, through all that suffering, you found me." Cairo rumbled again, that deep, contented sound that seemed to acknowledge something beyond human understanding. As if sensing that this moment was drawing to a close, the lion lifted his great head and looked directly into Marcus's eyes. For a long moment they held each other's gaze, predator and human, wild and civilized, past and present, all melting away until there were simply two souls recognizing each other across the vast divide of time and circumstance. The sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in shades of gold that matched Cairo's magnificent coat perfectly. The light seemed to emanate from the lion himself, creating an almost ethereal glow that made the moment feel touched by something divine. Marcus knew it was time to say goodbye, but he also knew now that this wasn't really an ending. It was a completion, a circle closing in the most beautiful way possible. Thank you," he whispered to Cairo, his voice carrying all the gratitude and love that 45 years of guilt had finally transformed into grace. "Thank you for letting me make amends. Thank you for teaching me that some wounds can heal, that some guilt can be forgiven, and that love transcends every boundary we think divides us." As if understanding every word, Cairo pressed against the fence one more time, allowing Marcus to scratch behind his ears the way he had done hundreds of times over the past 8 years. Then slowly, gracefully, the lion rose and walked a few steps back, settling into a regal sitting position in the golden grass. He remained there, watching, as Marcus was helped back into his wheelchair. "Will you make sure he's cared for?" Marcus asked Sarah, as James began pushing the wheelchair back down the path, both men understanding that this was truly goodbye. "Always," Sarah promised, her voice steady despite her tears. "And Marcus, the sanctuary will continue. Your legacy here is secure. But more than that, this story, Cairo's story, your story, it will be told. People need to know that redemption is possible, that love finds a way." Marcus nodded, taking one last look over his shoulder at Cairo, who remained sitting in the same spot, watching his friend depart with the dignity and grace that only the king of beasts could possess. The lion's golden eyes followed the wheelchair until it disappeared around a bend in the path, and then he continued sitting there as the sun set completely, as if keeping vigil. 3 weeks later, Marcus Wellington passed away peacefully in his sleep, surrounded by the few family members who had travelled to England for his final days. According to his will, the sanctuary would be fully endowed in perpetuity, ensuring that rescued animals would always have a home there. But perhaps more importantly, his story, and Cairo's story, would be told to every visitor, a reminder that healing is possible, forgiveness is real, and love knows no boundaries. On the morning after Marcus's death, Dr. Sarah Chen found Cairo lying by the fence where he had said goodbye to his friend. The lion remained there for 3 days, as if keeping vigil, refusing food and water, his golden eyes fixed on the path where Marcus would never again appear. When he finally moved, it was to a spot in the center of his enclosure where he could see the entire sanctuary, Marcus's sanctuary, spread out before him like a kingdom built on redemption. The staff noticed that Cairo seemed different after that, more peaceful somehow, more regal, as if he understood that he was not just a rescued animal, but a guardian of something precious, a living symbol of the power of love to heal old wounds and transform guilt into grace. Visitors to the sanctuary often commented on Cairo's extraordinary presence, the way he seemed to look right into their souls with those golden eyes. They didn't know the full story, of course. They didn't know about the mining operation in Kenya, or the 12 lions who died, or the businessman who spent 45 years carrying that weight. But they could sense something special about this place, something that went beyond simply providing homes for displaced animals. They could feel the love that had built these walls, the dedication that maintained these habitats, and the profound connection between human and animal that made true healing possible. And Cairo, the magnificent lion with the golden mane, continued to watch over it all, living proof that sometimes the most broken things, when touched by love and forgiveness, can become the most beautiful. This incredible true story reminds us that our past mistakes don't have to define us, and that healing can come from the most unexpected places. If you believe in the power of redemption and the profound connections we share with all living creatures, please like this video and subscribe to our channel. Share this story with someone who needs to be reminded that forgiveness is always possible and that love truly does conquer all. In the years that followed, the Marcus Wellington Memorial Wildlife Sanctuary became known not just as a refuge for rescued animals, but as a place of healing for humans as well. People came from around the world to hear the story of the businessman and the lion, and many left with their own wounds a little less painful, their own guilt a little lighter. Researchers studied the remarkable bond between Marcus and Cairo, trying to understand the psychological and emotional mechanisms that had allowed such profound interspecies connection. But the more they investigated, the more they realized that some phenomena transcend scientific explanation. Some bonds exist in the realm of the heart, where logic gives way to love and coincidence becomes providence. And Cairo, now the sanctuary's most famous resident, continued to teach the same lesson Marcus had learned in his final weeks: that redemption is possible, that forgiveness can flow both ways, and that sometimes the very thing we think we've lost forever finds a way to come home to us, transformed but unmistakably ours. The bond between Marcus and Cairo proved that love transcends species, time, and even death itself, a truth that continues to inspire all who hear their remarkable story. In a world often divided by fear and misunderstanding, their connection stands as testimony to the healing power of compassion, the reality of second chances, and the miraculous ways in which love finds its way home.